In this video, we are going to prove the validity of financial astrology with the 1987 crash. And we're going to prove it with using the 5 biggest planets in our solar system, or better said, the 5 biggest heavenly bodies, which is the Sun at the center, and then Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. These are like by far the 5 biggest bodies in our solar system, and in astrology we observe the things from the middle of the Earth, and that is why the Sun appears to be moving, because it reflects the movement of the Earth. So when we go back like a day, the Sun is at 24 degrees, the next day is at 25 degrees, and the next day is at 26 degrees of Libra. And I'm now going to enter the point G. I call this point G, and that's the midpoint of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. And we see on the day of the crash, on the evening of the crash, the Sun was in an exact square to the midpoint of Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, Neptune. Okay, that is so far so good, but every year the Sun will make this square once to the midpoint of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. So it doesn't explain why, particularly in this year, there was like the crash. And in order like for a crash to occur in astrology, we need a square. So during the 1989 crash, Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, Neptune, they were like in square positions. And that like provided the setup for the crash. But when we look here, there is no square between Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, Neptune. So why then was there like a crash on this day? In order to answer that, we have to look like deeper into the setup of these 4 planets of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. But before I do this, I want to show something interesting. In this setup here, there does not appear to be an aspect between Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, Neptune. However, if we like divide this astrological pie into 7 parts instead of 12 parts, then we see that Jupiter, Saturn here is at 12.3 degrees in the 7th signs, and Uranus, Neptune is at 12.4 degrees in the 6th signs. So they are actually at the same degree of the sign, or in other words, they are in a 7 harmonic aspect. And because of that, the midpoint of these 2 bodies, I would say, becomes very strong. But still, even if this is like a good explanation for why there should be like a change of trend if the Sun makes an exact aspect to the point G, because there is this very narrow 7 harmonic aspect between Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus, Neptune, it does not explain why there is a crash, because for the crash we need like a square. So now I'm going to enter some other planets into the picture, and the first planet is Jupiter. That's like the biggest. It's the biggest heavenly body in our solar system after the Sun. And now we see something interesting. The Sun is in opposition to Jupiter, and Jupiter is in square to this point G. So now we have a T-square, and the T-square is like a wonderful setup for an astrological crash. And I'm going to prove this here because I enter here the Sun-Jupiter midpoint. So this is the midpoint here of Sun and Jupiter. And on the day, on the evening of the crash, it's exactly conjunct to Chi. While on the day before, it is not conjunct to Chi. And on the day after, it is also not conjunct to Chi. Only on the day of the crash, the Sun-Jupiter midpoint is conjunct to Chi, or Chi balances the opposition between Sun and Jupiter. So this is what I call a balanced T-square, exact on the day of the crash. And this is one reason why we had the crash on this day. Now, I believe there is a second reason, although this explanation, in my opinion, would be enough to give a good reason why the crash was on this day, because it doesn't happen every year that Jupiter or another planet is in square like to Chi. It happens very rarely that one of the 4 planets that makes up this point Chi is actually in square to the point Chi. And I want to bring in now the next planet, that is Neptune. And we see that Jupiter, Neptune, and the Sun, they are like in what is called cardinal signs. So Neptune is in a sign that is square to the sign of Jupiter. So here we have a square between Jupiter and Neptune, and what is interesting is that 24.5 plus 5.5 equals 30, and there's 30 degrees in a zodiac. So there's a strong connection between Jupiter and Neptune, and a strong connection creates a midpoint, and this midpoint is here. This midpoint is in the sign of Pisces, and I now bring in the other planets, which are Saturn here and Uranus. And you see that Saturn and Uranus, they are both in the sign of Sagittarius. They're very close to each other, and for that reason they create a strong midpoint. And I'm now going to enter this midpoint. That is the midpoint here at 20.5 degrees between Saturn and Uranus. And this is the Jupiter-Neptune midpoint. And if you do the math, you will see that the midpoint of Saturn-Uranus and Jupiter-Neptune is exactly this point G. It's the same as the midpoint of Uranus-Neptune and Jupiter-Saturn. And the interesting thing is that Jupiter-Neptune is in the sign Pisces, which is square to the sign of Saturn-Uranus. So now we have like the same setup as in 1929. We have like a midpoint of 2 of the 4 largest planets that is in a sign square to the midpoint of 2 other large planets. Here Jupiter-Neptune is square to the sign to Saturn-Uranus, but there's also an aspect because this is a 36 harmonic. So if I like divide that pi into 36 pieces, then we have here Jupiter-Neptune at 0 degrees and Saturn-Uranus at 0 degrees. So this creates an aspect on the 36 harmonic in square sign. And that is now a second square in addition to this T-square here. So we have 2 squares, and this happens very rarely. And that is the reason why there was like a crash on this day and not on the day before, which was actually like a Sunday. So already in the morning we had like futures were way down because the sun was like squaring this G point, and then on the close of the day it was the lowest low like in a decade actually until now in the Dow Jones. And the Sun Jupiter midpoint was exactly conjunct this point G. But now when this crash occurred, a lot of analysts were thinking, oh my goodness, this is now the same as 1929. This is like a huge crash. and this is going to be terrible. But actually, this was like the end of the bear market. Yeah, so this day marked the end of the bear market. And the question now to ask is there like an astrological sign? Was there an astrological sign that this day marked the end of the bear market, as opposed to the next day, or the next day after the next day, or the day like in a week, or the day in a month? Is there like an astrological sign that this day, only this day, was the end of the bear market? And I can answer this by moving the horoscope one day ahead. And when I do this, you see now that Jupiter Neptune midpoint has jumped into the sign of Aquarius and is now no longer in a square aspect, in a square sign to the sign of Saturn Uranus. And also on the 36 harmonic, they're not on the same degree anymore, because this is now at 0 degrees and this is at 9.9 degrees, while on the previous day, on the day of the crash, they were both at 0 degrees. And this was the main reason and a strong astrological sign that this was like a long-term bottom, because that 36 harmonic aspect with these two bodies in square in square signs would never happen again. We did later have like some minor aspects on the 29th and 28th harmonic with Saturn, Uranus, and Jupiter, Neptune, and one was January 20, where the Sun was conjunct G, January 20 of 1988, and this marked like another bottom in the market. But the condition, it wasn't a major 36th harmonic aspect and square signs. So that for that reason, and there wasn't like this other square here. So for that reason, with only these 5 planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, we can see why the crash only has happened on this day, and why on the next day, when Jupiter Neptune was no longer in square to Saturn Uranus, a bull market would start.